Good morning. So we're talking about Epiphany Machine, which is a collaborative project across many disciplines. And we'll just briefly introduce ourselves, and then we're going to watch a short trailer here. So my name is Zach Dewar. I am an associate professor in the School of Visual Art, and I worked a lot on the visualizations of this piece.
Hi, my name is Daniel English. I'm an assistant professor in the School of Neuroscience, and I worked sort of behind the scenes interpreting some of the neural data for the project.
Hi, my name is Scotty Hardwig. I teach in the School of Performing Arts, Movement and Dance. I know many of you. Hello.
Hi everyone, my name is Noor Tasneem. I am a PhD student in translational biology, medicine, and health, and I was responsible for coding and programming the neural data over to the visualization side for Zach.
And then not here today is actually the PI of the project, Julia Basso, who is in, I can never remember exactly what it is, Human Nutrition, Foods, and Exercise Science. I think of her as a neuroscientist, but she does all this other work too. And she's on a plane at this moment, so she couldn't join us today. We're going to start by watching a short 1-minute trailer, if you want to turn that on.
One, two, animal, machine, 0, 1, 2, 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 animal, machine, 7, 5, engine.
So we performed this piece a few times in last semester in the SAM lab in the Moss Arts Center. And I think we're going to start by talking about some of the research questions that were driving, why we did this project.
So we wanted to work with dancers, and we wanted to work with electroencephalography to ask a couple of questions that were interesting to us. One is, what does the brain look like when we're performing as dancers and we shift between different states of performance? So for example, does the brain exhibit different activity when we're dancing with our eyes closed? Is it different when we're doing something that's memorized, something that's rigidly choreographed, something that we kind of know and we can do on repeat? Or does it look different when we're improvising and we have no idea what's going to come next? These are kind of different embodied states that we talk about as dancers and choreographers, and also different embodied states that we all go through in our lives. So it was a way of using dance to ask some neuroscientific questions and diving into that literature and perhaps advancing the field through something that we hoped would be both an art project and a scientific study. So for me, one of the most interesting things about this project is that this wasn't just a concert. It was a concert. It was an artistic piece. But it was also a way of gathering data and being able to compare the brainwaves of two dancers over a long period of time, through rehearsals, through performances, and then ultimately we're going to analyze this data, we haven't yet, and possibly publish some papers about our results. And so this goes into the nitty-gritty of, how do different movement tasks affect brain activity, how are different brain areas activated during these different states. But then we also had this other element where we wanted to use projection to somehow visualize the data, and how would that both provide a context, a visual context for audiences, but also perhaps affect us as performers if we could see our brain activity affecting the environment of the performance. Would that also affect us and create a kind of reciprocal feedback loop? So these were some of our questions, and that sort of started us off. And then, Dan, do you want to talk about the electrical activity we were looking at?
Yeah, so in this project, as Scotty was saying, we're looking at people doing very different things, and specifically during different movement practices. And If you step back and think about what the brain is doing during different human interactions in general, and just throughout your day, you can think of the brain operating in sort of different modes. And so there's some modes, like when you're sleeping, and you have these very slow oscillations. And then on the other end, you have these fast oscillations that are these gamma oscillations. And those occur more when you're doing like a concentrated task. And then you have where you require a lot of like high-level cognitive processing. Say when you're trying to mirror somebody's movement as opposed to when you're just doing something you memorized, right? You're not going to need to necessarily process online that interaction if you practice it ahead of time. So gamma is like this online processing. And then in the middle, you have different states. So like the alpha state, which is more when you're like quietly at rest or reflecting, and you have like beta activity, which is more related to specific movement. And so we see a lot of dynamics across these different oscillatory activities or different modes of brain operation that occur throughout the different parts of the performance.
Yeah, so as Dr. English mentioned, we were primarily focused on three specific brainwaves for this performance. And so from going to slower to faster, we were specifically looking at theta, alpha, and beta. And those were segmented into three different aspects or three different chapters within this performance. And so how did we actually have access to this data, right? And so the EEG data was being collected through a native software called the Brain Vision Recorder. However, you can remotely access that data through different programming languages. So the one that we chose for this performance was MATLAB. Then through MATLAB, I actually collected the data, did some nice filtering to it, because as you move around, the data gets a little noisy, but you can start cleaning it up with the filter. And then we're starting to analyze the data in small 1-second segments. And so the code itself would collect all this data. And bear in mind, we're sampling this data at 500 hertz. So we're getting a piece of data every 2 milliseconds. So it's coming in quite fast, right? And so we would collect it within these 1-second segments and then run this sort of fast Fourier transform to see how powerful those theta, alpha, beta rhythms were in every single electrode in Scotty and Dr. Basso's EEG caps. But for each segment of the performance, we were specifically interested in specific regions of the brain, right? And so for alpha oscillations, they're quite prominent in the back of the brain around your occipital region. So you have 3 different electrodes that are recording data right here. And so we were able to average out the theta, alpha, and beta rhythms within those specific alpha rhythms for those specific electrodes for the alpha segment of the performance. For theta, we were more interested in spatial navigation, and that's typically done within the premotor cortex up here towards the front. So we started averaging data in the theta for power and theta bands in those frontal electrodes. And then there's also a segment of the performance called beta synchronization, where we actually looked at the beta power for all electrodes and started seeing how well they synchronized across Dr. Basso and Scotty's EEG caps. And then the data was eventually streamed up into open sound control, and that's where Zach started doing more visuals.
Yeah, I'm just smiling because if that sounded complicated, it very much was. It took about 3 months for us to figure out the technical elements of how we would also clean up some of the data, because when you move, muscles create an electromagnetic field, and that interferes with electroencephalography, so we had to figure out a way of dealing with that. We had to get both of the computers to have MATLAB in the first place, and then pipe that over to another computer for the visuals. So it's just like, I just love hearing you explain it, because it was super complicated.
So a lot of this was just figuring out how to get clean data and how to make meaning of that data. And I want to come back to that in just a second. But first of all, just finishing this idea of the pipeline. So when Newer was done processing in MATLAB, he used open sound control to send the data off to Mic Machine, which is across the room, just on a local area network. And we actually did a lot of different things. We tried stuff in Maximus P, we tried stuff in Unreal. We ended up using something in processing for a sort of more 2D representation of this data. And just in terms of pure like technical process, OSC into processing, everything being visualized there. And then, it's like a crazy system over there, because they've got in another room entirely, there's a machine that's driving the projectors in the room that you're in. And so you're like on a machine remoting into this other machine. You're just on like a monitor and mouse remoting this other machine, and then you connect via another like local area network using NDI to like stream your video through OBS. I'm just going to all these acronyms, right? So figuring out all that stuff took a while, but the guys over there are amazing. Tanner and Brandon and David and Gustavo, thank you all for all of the work that you did on this. It's huge. We could not have done it without you. But let's move on from just some of the technical stuff. Can we talk about what we were, here, let's just play this first. Yeah, this is one of the first experiments that we tried to do in Unreal Engine of visualizing the data. Originally, I was camping, and I was like, I'd forgotten why I started doing all this, which is just because I like wanted to make art that looked like waves in the ocean and clouds. And so I started there. And this is a little bit hard to see because this is taken on my phone that's on a projection on the cyclorama in the sandbox. But we were just playing with like translating the data into objects that would move, that would like pulse with the data and then disturb the water and create ripples. The problem is that you really couldn't tell what was going on. It was very difficult to interpret any of the data that way because there's some ripples in the water, but how does that correlate to what's going on? And so a lot of our time was spent on that question. How do we actually want to represent that data? Can you actually go back a few slides to the slide that Dan was talking on? One more. Yeah. So in the upper left here, what you have is each of these horizontal lines corresponds to one of the sensors on the EEG caps, right? So they're wearing these caps on their heads with all this gel that takes them like 30, 45 minutes with someone inserting gel into their head to get them to work. And you can see the pattern over there. That little bump on the top is their nose. So you can see how these sensors are laid out on their head, and each is just giving an electrical signal, right? And so that's the raw data. And in one of the movements of this piece, we decided that we just wanted to show some of that raw data. We just want it to be there as a literal thing. And that's in the second movement of the piece you were there. There's these big blue circles, and they're showing numbers, and these numbers are just the raw amplitude values that are coming in through these headsets. But at the same time, we also wanted to try to help the audience find some meaning in seeing what was going on with the choreography with these two dancers and how they're relating to each other, and then how does that manifest up on the screen. And thank God for these folks, because I would have had no idea how to do that myself or how any of this means, right? But with Noor's processing, he was essentially able to say, hey, look, when one of the dancers is in a resting state and the other is in improvisational state, for example, and Scotty can talk more about this in a second, there's a difference here. And then that gives me like one number, and then I can take one number and I can make that into something on the screen. So for example, Scotty's tree, his little fractal tree, grows when he's at rest. And then when he starts moving and Julia goes at rest, the inverse happens. And so even though it's still data-driven, it's very clear and interpretable for what's happening in the movement at the same time. And so we wanted to access both of those ideas. And the words that I think Scotty found to talk about this are the data interpretability and the data fidelity, right? And so in one part, it's just data fidelity. It's literally the data. It's you can see it very directly, right? And on the other hand is the data interpretability, where you can start to, it's been processed through many different layers, but you can start to try to understand our understanding of what it means. Do you guys want to talk about that at all?
Yeah, one thing I learned through this process is that brain data is really complicated. And it took us a while to figure out what it was that we wanted to look at and how could we visualize that in a way that it would make sense to an audience. So I think what you're speaking to, but we also wanted to be true to the data. We didn't want to manipulate anything that was happening, although we ended up manipulating it in some ways to sort of, compensate for the artifacting. But I guess, is this a video? Yes, it is. Couple things that we found. There's three sections in this piece. The first one looks at alpha waves, and what we found basically from the literature is that when we have our eyes closed and we're moving, alpha activity increases. And when we have our eyes open and we're kind of operating in the world, alpha activity decreases. So actually I might just go to the I mean, should we explain each of the sections? We created a choreographic game, basically, where one dancer would have their eyes closed and would be sort of like amping up on this meditative state, and that created a result in the alpha waves. And then Zach designed these sort of trees that you were mentioning, where one tree would grow faster based on the incoming alpha levels. So that was one whole section choreographically of the piece. The second section was beta waves, which activate just prior to movement. At least that's what the literature suggests. And for that section, we designed basically a rigid unison choreographic phrase that we did exactly the same, both of us, and repeated it over and over and over again. And for that, Zach created a visualization, like you were saying, of like just the data, and you did it in like blue and black, and you color-coded it in particular ways. But that section was basically to be able to look at the differences between us if we were doing the exact same series of gestures the same way every time. And then the third section was focused on theta oscillations, and basically one of us would improvise through the space, the theory being that theta activity increases when we're up and out and aware and spatially navigating. And this sort of bore out in that section, although it was like our baselines were a little different, so it wasn't always 100% perfect. And Zach designed this kind of fractal Perlin noise landscape to correlate to when one person's theta waves were higher. So when one person was up and moving around in the space, that landscape would grow, and when they were seated and doing nothing, the landscape would recede. And so we had this kind of like dual landscapes that were kind of going back and forth. So the choreographic design was created basically based on what we were seeing in the neuroscientific literature and also in the data. And there was some sort of back and forth around how to construct that.
We're gonna, while we do Q&A, we're gonna have the video of the performance up, and we can kind of skip through it so you can see some of this, but just for the sake of time, well, we're gonna wrap up talking about what is happening next for this project. So first of all, just rewinding a little bit, no, it's okay, just with in time. We've discovered that Julia is really, really excellent at communicating the work that we're doing, and she got the New York Times to come and record a performance and publish an article about this process. The project won an award for the best public art, which I think is an interesting. It was private, kind of, like it was in a closed room, but it was open to the public. I'm not sure how it's public art, but from the Raw Science Festival, is that right? Raw Science Film Festival, thank you, yeah. Yeah, public, yeah, right. It's not a film. And then the program on CBS, Mission Unstoppable, with, Jess, help me here, what's the name of the, Miranda Cosgrove, they're coming to film next Tuesday to do another, like a 1 hour or a short segment on the project. And then last of all, and this was mentioned before, the next step also is data analysis and trying, because every rehearsal, every performance, everything was recorded the entire time, and not just in video, but also with all of the data coming in the EEG headsets. And so to try to filter through all of that and figure out what we can determine from the data itself. So that is the next steps. We're at time to go to questions here. Does anyone else have anything they want to add before that? Okay, thank you all, and if you have any questions, please go ahead.
All right, what questions do we have? Heading your way. You're next.
Right, sorry. Hi, thanks so much. This is really fascinating. I'm particularly interested in that challenge of how do you sort of marry the raw data that's coming in and how that impacts what happens in the performance. And I'm wondering, you talked a little bit about looking at the literature to inform some of those decisions. I'm also wondering if there was anything else that kind of drove you, or if you allowed for or engaged in any kind of just like play where you're like, oh, this is interesting, what if we did this? Because if I kick my elbow out, that turns blue, and that's fun. Or, you know, how did those processes kind of like come together, and where might you take them next?
That's a great question. I think anytime that we're in the studio, we're always playing, right? We always have some system, and we're pushing on the boundaries of it and figuring out what it can do for us. I think this one was difficult because there was so much iteration time between an idea and then trying to go backwards through into the data and what that means and filtering out artifacts and then trying to pipe it back over and create some sort of data representation that slowed down a lot of that play. But I think it's still especially evident in the choreography and the relationship between the choreography and what you see on the screen. Do you want to talk about that too? I'm going to try to skip this video forward.
Yeah, and I think, you know, when I work with technology as an artist, and Zach and I have collaborated many times on processes like this, and that's really how we like to work. We like to set up a system, play with it, see what happens, see what we like. The difference, I think, with this project is that it ended up not being that simple. Like, it's just not as simple as I move my elbow here and something happens. You have to know what you're looking for, simply because the brain data is really dense, and you can sort of try to decide ahead of time like what region of the brain you're looking at, but in the end we actually had to look at patterns rather than like this kind of immediate like feedback play that we might do with like a motion capture system or something like that, if that kind of makes sense. Does it make sense what I'm saying at all? Do you want to say anything about that, you or Dan?
Thank you. Very cool project. I'm just wondering, humans are social, dance is social. There's research on heart rate variability, synchrony, and social cohesion. Have you thought of integrating heart rate variability into this as another measure to collect? Also, with surface measures like EEG, you can't really get into things like default mode network and anterior cingulate. Related to like self-referential thinking, are you doing other measures to see how the dancers are seeing each other, taking perspective on each other after the event?
That might be the next grant. I mean, I felt like we had our hands full just with this task personally, but I mean, I don't know, what do you think?
Yeah, so certainly, actually, heart rate variability is something that we're measuring. So Julia, who, Dr. Basso is not here, could speak most to this because her work as a neuroscientist is combining art and science, and also in that realm, like the body-brain connection. So certainly those things are on our mind, and in future studies, I'm not sure if we were also collecting heart rate variability here, but that's definitely something that we do in other experiments to correlate those two things. And of course, EEG is limited to recording the very surface of your brain, of course. And unfortunately, there's not really a way, like functional MRI or something, you could look at specific deep brain areas. Those machines take up, a quarter of this room. And so we're working with what we have at the moment, but of course, as technology develops, we're going to adapt with that too. The whole mobile EEG system, there were artifacts and so forth, but without this very specific system, this would have been totally impossible. Like mobile EEG and multiple people and having even this level of like veridical activity integrated into the art is really very cutting edge.
Thank you. I saw when Julia and Scotty were dancing, the trees would start and grow, and then they would stop, and there's another tree growing again. Is there a criteria for when they start, or so does it relate to movement or opening or closing their eyes, or is it just a matter of data gets saturated and you need another tree? Thank you.
It's gathering the total alpha power from each of us in a particular part of our brain, and then using that to drive the growth of the trees. So when one person's alpha power is higher, the tree grows faster, until a reset point. I mean, you want to talk about that? Like it had to be kind of a cyclical visualization.
Yeah, so with that first section we just saw, each of these trees sort of grows up from the bottom, and they're just being driven at the speed of the alpha power, right? And so this is something that we thought we could see pretty well during performance, was one tree would go faster, the other tree would slow down. and then they would change who was being active and who was meditating, and then the other tree would grow faster and the other one would slow down. But the trees eventually reset because they'd sort of, just visually, I'd sort of developed this pattern, and it was important that I think it was important that it reset to the original like stem growing up so you could see more clearly how quickly it was developing. If it just kept changing over time, it would be harder to understand because you're not sure what's coming next, right? And so you're not sure where it's going, so you're not sure how fast relatively it's going, but if you've seen the same tree grow a few times, now you understand the relative speed of how fast they're growing in relationship to each other. That was the idea.
First, a quick statement, and I guess it's for all four of you, but I was also thinking specifically of Dan and Nora. There's a class that's led by Lisa McNair called ID Pro, Interdisciplinary Projects, and this seems like a wonderful, all the data analysis, I mean the enormous amount of data analysis you have done, seems like great undergraduate student projects to work on that. So that's a statement. The question I have is the classic ICAT question. From either the science side of things, have you seen, and you mentioned publishing a paper, have you seen anything yet that happened like, wow, that's really interesting, I haven't seen that. And from the artistic standpoint, if you remove the fact that EEG was embedded behind this, was there anything artistically that came out of it that was like, wow, that's really interesting. I wouldn't have generated that before, and this is really something I like.
Do you guys want to talk about the science part of it first?
So in terms of the science, very few studies have looked at like perfectly synchronized human brain activity during this kind of movement. And so you have to remember that all the visualizations wouldn't move if there weren't for the brain activity, right? So the whole dynamic of the movement is driven by something about the brain activity. And so we are able to look at people moving and their brain at the same time. And the brain activity, the most surprising things weren't in relation to what a single person was doing. It wasn't that, well, when a certain person moves this way, oh, well, that unexpectedly lit up this part of the brain. It was more that when there was interactions between people, we saw synchrony in certain of these frequency bands, and those were the, like, that's funny, which is what we always want to see in science, like, I didn't expect that, let's figure that out. So there definitely were some surprising moments where we saw, really strong synchrony between two people's brains, and that was really the most novel and exciting thing from the neuroscience side.
I mean, I think for me as an artist, I kind of already said this, but creating a work of art that is also science, this is probably the closest I've come to that aspirational goal. It's really hard to do. It's really hard to do because the goals of science and the goals of artists are not necessarily the same, and the processes, therefore, are slightly different. So what it kind of excites me the most about this is that we were both doing art and doing science. Not one for the other, or the other for one, but like it was kind of both the same thing. I don't know that we were 100% successful at that. I mean, you guys can tell, when we go to write the paper, maybe you can tell me. But there were all kinds of things popping up scientifically. Like Dr. Basso and I have different baseline levels. I'm not clear whether that is a feature of electroencephalography or just the fact that we are different people and we have different movement experiences, we're different as performers. Or that I'm just very strange. But like, yeah, these questions were coming up and I think were some of the most interesting stuff in the piece. Do you want to talk about that more?
I mean, I'll just echo what both of you all were saying too. I mean, I think the field itself is quite novel. I mean, Dr. Basso and I were at this international science conference, I guess about less than a month ago, right? And there was a massive talk towards like the first day given by Susan Maxman on like your brain and art, right? And so like it's a relatively new concept. I think a lot more studies, especially looking at brain imaging techniques, have been a little bit more focused towards the music side. But I do think like we're doing something special here at Virginia Tech, where we're one of the first labs like kind of going into a foray of looking at like what the brain does during dance, right? And so as Dr. English mentioned, right, I mean the whole concept of mobile brain imaging is also relatively new, and when looking at the field of EEG. And so, but I mean, with it comes, a lot of challenges, right? I mean, just like signal processing and also just like interacting. And, I mean, we did have a lot of conflicts during this, while developing this piece, right? Because, I mean, to what extent are we, is the art form changing to bring a little bit more scientific validation and vice versa.
All right.
I just want to give a lot of credit to Julia. She really embodies the art-science crossover, and without her, this project would not be possible. So thank you.
Thank you. Well, we are at time. I want to thank you all for being here today and thank you all for presenting and sharing your work with us. This is great, transdisciplinary. ICAT loves this stuff. It's fabulous. I hope you all have a great rest of your Friday and weekend as well, and we'll be back here again next week with more donuts and coffee and more mind-blowing presentations. See you then.